All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back for another ICMI Q&A with Douglas Wallace. There might be a bit of echo there going on, Douglas, which is funny because we've been online for quite a while and didn't experience any echo earlier. Oh, looks like, are we still getting that? A little bit. That's okay. We should be all right. It's funny because we tested the audio just before and it was perfectly fine. Let's press ahead. So I've got Natalie Powell, who's my co-host during the Australian leg of ICMI. Douglas, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I've been involved with the men's movement slightly since about the late 1980s. But I became an advocate and activist since about 2004. I think I explained I became an administrator of a global forum for men's issues. This was an early introduction for me into the worldwide commonality of issues. I spent most of my time on either international organizations or trying to keep in touch with aspects of the men's and the family movements, various countries around the world. The rest of my time is spent tackling local issues, UK government, right down to my local village level.
Very good. So I really enjoyed your talk, actually. There's a particular area of interest of mine. So the international level and geopolitics, international politics and what's going on. The United Nations, I think, as we were saying before, I think the United Nations has many problems from a wide variety of angles. And it's really particularly interesting. I thought that you were talking about feminism within the United Nations. I personally was aware of the feminist biases within the UN, but I think your talk really presses home how serious this is, and perhaps even more serious there within the UN than I thought it was. So I thought, if anything, we might just start by, you were talking about feminism within the UN and the effect on the world, and you mentioned in particular top-down control. Is that, are you sort of looking there at feminists within the UN and then able to disseminate a feminist message around the world? Is that kind of what you were getting at there?
Yes. You can see the policies being originated and things being talked about in the United Nations. Like I could tell you, I could talk about right now about what's going to be coming up. And with a fair degree of confidence, will be coming up in your country within 2 years. And I know this because I keep an eye on what the global feminists are doing, and that's where it comes from. When I first started looking at the global level, I wasn't entirely sure. Yes, what interested me initially was the fact the way that a particular event happened, and the word about equalities, the way they started talking about it, changed over a very short period of time, right around the world. And that's not, that doesn't come from a ground up movement. You don't get that kind of, that relatively sudden change.
Yeah.
But I was still not entirely sure. And it did take me a year or two to be sure, because then I could see, watching at the international level, and see it filtering down and out. Yeah. And then I could see, okay, national governments are now talking about it, and I saw that 2 years previously. So yes, it is undoubtedly affecting. Whether that is a feminist hierarchy, recognized, discussing things and making orders, as it were, to national feminists, frankly, I doubt. I don't think the conspiracy, it's not that kind of a conspiracy going on. It's more in terms of the national feminists talk about certain things, decide certain things, and this filters out in the same way as anything else does from the United Nations.
Yeah, that's so. Yes, I've also been quite a little. I'm always suspicious of claims of widespread conspiracies that somehow remain undetected. It is interesting, actually, though, to think that that feminism at a national level, I guess, could be disseminating that information through the United Nations. Is really what you're getting at there.
Yes.
Yes. Right.
And of course, this is why, as I think I pointed out in the speech, this is why, you go to an ICMI and you hear, what somebody is talking about is happening in their country. And while the detail of it might be different, chances are it's happening in your own country. And you're thinking, yeah, it's in our country as well. I get that.
Yeah.
And it's all the same. And that's because it is all the same and it has the common base.
That is interesting, actually, because that's right, you do see the same types of things being copied or going from one country to another, or appearing in one country to another. Probably their application is just a little different, but yes, you do see the same sorts of trends. So I do think you're probably on the right track there. There's definitely a well-connected network, and it's interesting that the men's rights movement and the men's rights, or the men's community, I guess I could call it, I don't want to say manosphere, but the men's community is not quite set up that way. We tend to have autonomous groups, and there's we sort of coordinate where it's necessary, but I think the setup seems to be quite different to the way feminism is set up.
Yes, there is aspects of internationalism in the men's movement, and that will be growing. And next year, I think we can expect to see an international organization specifically for men's rights. But I obviously don't want to talk too much about that until we actually see it.
Yes, absolutely. So there are other aspects that we were actually talking about before, which I think you mentioned that you didn't really talk about much in the actual presentation itself, but you'd be happy to have a chat about now. Concepts like cultural Marxism, and I know that's a huge can of worms. So where would you like to start?
Well, yeah, as you say, I deliberately avoided it in my talk because once you start talking about cultural Marxism, you've still got half of the men's rights movement not really believing that it is anything to do with it. And quite naturally, you've also got a lot of people on the left wing who think, oh, this is just the right wing of the men's rights movement, how are we going to go at the left wing? Because they're talking about Marxism. But in actual fact, so yeah, I'll address that bit to start with. Marxism is not socialism. And when I say that, I think most people on the left wing will accept that. Marxism might be defined as being a version of socialism, but it is not socialism. And a lot of left-wing people are not communists and they're not Marxists. If they are, well, unfortunately, they're going to be finding themselves in a battle with men's rights because men's rights are being fought by feminists, and feminism is a branch of cultural Marxism. But let me explain what cultural Marxism a little bit as well, because a lot of people think cultural Marxism is a version of Marxism, and it's not. It's a way of getting Marxism into place. And that's something that's quite important to understand. That back in the 1930s, there were effectively the major way of introducing communism into other countries was the way that the Russian communists were looking at it, is you walk in with the tanks. And you take your army in and you convert the country to communism. And there became a group that said, no, that's not actually the best way to go about it, because all you're going to do is end up with a populace that doesn't want communism. What you've got to do is, first of all, is get those people to want communism. So they developed a system whereby you could get a cultural change first so that the people end up wanting communism. And that's what cultural Marxism is. Someone's put Marxism is the butter, cultural Marxism. No, cultural Marxism isn't even a wrapper. That doesn't fit. It is the method. It's cultural Marxism. And that's all it is. It's a way of getting Marxism is by affecting the culture.
So, Douglas was just responding to a comment by Sean there. Marxism is the butter, cultural Marxism is the wrapper. Yeah, so that was just so listeners in the future can know what you were responding to there, Douglas.
Right.
Yes, please go on. Yes.
So yeah, as you say, it's an enormous subject, but if one is purely interested in men's rights, that's obviously fine. And men's rights are combated by the aspect of the cultural Marxist that is feminism. And I challenge anyone in the men's rights movement to be a genuine activist and not find themselves having to be an anti-feminist. I have tried. I've thought, that it's just a waste of effort fighting feminists instead of fighting for men's issues. And I still think that, actually. I'd still try to just fight for men's issues. But to fight for men's issues, you are going to find yourself being opposed by feminists and feminist organizations. That's my experience, and it's experience of everybody, I think, I've ever talked to who's attempted to get stuff going for men. Not even that, because on the parental alienation side, if people have been paying attention to this ICMI on parental alienation, they've been hearing that even when you've got women being hurt hugely by an issue, if men are being hurt, feminists don't give a damn. They're going to attack. They don't want parental alienation to be recognized, even though half of the victims of parental alienation are women and girls.
Right. And we see that consistently with feminism, absolutely.
Yeah.
And there are several speeches during this ICMI relating to parental alienation. There's a presentation by Jan James in the UK, by Amanda Sillars in Australia, and we also got them together for a third one when we talked about coercive control and parental alienation. So, and there are also a number of other talks sort of that do touch on the topic. So, I think it's this year particularly, it's a topic that we've started to cover well, which is good, because I think we need to talk more about it.
Yes, and Jan James herself is a particularly interesting case because she's coming from a charity that cares about children in different ways, particularly actually from road traffic accidents aspect. So she is completely new into this kind of field where all of a sudden, without any background in men's issues, without any background in having to fight feminists, she is purely coming into it trying to help and save children, and she's finding herself very shockingly for her up against feminists.
Yes. And if you're not prepared, it really is a shock. And yes, it's unfortunate she kind of stepped on a mine there, perhaps, wasn't?
Yes. Yeah.
No. Go on.
So the reason to bring up cultural Marxism in terms of the international aspect is not only because I think it's generally worthwhile people who are well aware already of men's rights issues being aware that the enemy to men's rights issues is fundamentally cultural Marxist, but it's also to highlight the fact that if what you want is a healthy society in general, then there are other aspects of cultural Marxism which you will have to be addressing. It's not just about men's rights.
Yeah.
There is more to it than that. Most especially family issues, for an example, and free speech. And these aspects, which are not distinctly and necessarily part of feminism, are distinctly part of cultural Marxism. And if you care about the family and if you care about free speech, you're going to have to be fighting a slightly broader battle.
Well, one thing I've looked at over the years is the possibility of, to a certain extent, one needs to specialise, and I figure people who work in a particular area like men's rights can coordinate in other areas, and that's what we've tended to find. For example, with Amanda Sillars with parental alienation. I mean, Amanda's presented at a number of our conferences now. Her focus overlaps with the men's rights issues because parental alienation is an issue, and it's been great how we've been able to work together in a number of ways, and that's what we see actually. What we've been seeing anyway, where people, and we've got friends and allies in children's rights activists too. In fact, I find it really interesting how many other groups out there are willing to talk to us, at least on the quiet, when there's common cause.
Well, that is something which, unfortunately, I had to cut out of my speech because of time limitations. But I did initially, in my speech, have a lot more talk about the fact that we do have a lot of allies out there. Now, these allies might not agree with everything that you also agree with, but you just have to put that aside. If they agree with the issue that you're fighting on, for goodness sake, combine with them on that issue. Yeah. You might find in another discussion that you're actually, against them, but that's fine. It's a fine, mature, societal way of going about things. So yeah, so definitely, look for those allies, and if they're allies on one issue that you're fighting, go with it, and make yourself friends with them, because apart from anything, that's going to make the issue when you do disagree with them, it's then going to be much easier to talk with them and try to convince them.
Yeah. And in actual fact, I think that's exactly what we're seeing. So I think the men's rights movement really exists at a nexus of a number of other movements, fathers' rights movements and parental alienation and domestic violence and intactivism and so forth. A lot of those groups won't agree with each other, but they all agree with, or we all agree with them on their particular issue, which I think puts us at the nexus. And my feeling is, I don't know how you feel about it, Douglas, but my feeling is that over the last few years, I've been involved, going on about 10 years now, that a lot of those groups have actually moved closer to our position over the last 10 years, as they've gradually started to realize that what they're looking at is kind of more of a symptom of a bigger problem. Even though they continue to specialize, they see it as a symptom of a bigger problem. That's been my feeling anyway.
Yeah, and specialization, although I talked, about there's a broader thing to be fighting, but specialization is absolutely fine, and I've got no problem with that. I'm not a particular specialist. I'm more of a lightweight that covers all sorts of different aspects and areas. There are only 2 or 3 areas I dip into with any depth. But that's my position. That's where I fit in the men's rights movement, is, being a contact person who knows lots of people and lots of issues, but not necessarily to huge depths. But I only have 24 hours in the day, unfortunately, so that's all I can manage. But absolutely, if you're going to really, if you're interested in a particular issue, contact people like me if you can't find any allies, because people like me can normally find you an ally. And I'm not the only one, obviously there's people like Paul Elam, and Mike Buchanan as well. Excellent people who can put you in touch with other people. But yeah, fight the narrow battle by all means, but just stay in that battle and stay in the fight.
In actual fact, we do a lot of networking with connecting different groups up, and at times that's yielded some very positive results actually. It does seem to be it has been an effective strategy over the years, absolutely. So Sean's got a question. He's actually been sitting there. His question's been sitting there for a little while. Have you made an estimate of the financial cost worldwide of UN mandated feminist agencies and practices? I think it's a really interesting question.
Wow. Let's start with the easy part of that question, which is the financial cost of feminist bodies. UN Women, for example, gets $500 million a year. Yeah, I think it took a recently had to take a budget cut, and it was complaining, because it only had $500 million now. When you think of just if the men's movement just had 1% of that kind of money, how much we could do with it. It's stupid. But UN Women, although it is the most visible part of the United Nations feminist group, it is actually just a small part of it. And the rest of the feminist groups, if you add them up, as best as I've been able to, come to around another $1.5 billion. I'm talking US dollars here. But outside of the UN, you've then got groups like AWID and the others, and you start looking at their budgets, and they actually shrink the UN into almost nothing. It's extraordinary. So you start talking about the international feminist bodies, and you start looking at an annual budget of around $7 billion. Then you start looking down at the national level. Now, the USA there is a good example. The USA feminists get a lot of money out of the VAWA Act. And you start looking at what comes out of there. And if you think that what comes out of the VAWA Act is going into women's shelters, I definitely encourage you to have a look. If you're any kind of ability to read accounts, have a look into it. A very small part of the money that the taxpayer pays on what is supposed to be violence against women actually is going straight into feminist organizations. Deliberately on all kinds of feminist organized operations, political actions, lobbying. It gets crazy. But there we're talking, for example, just on that one budget, I think it's $2.7 billion. So it kind of gets a bit out of hand, and you start adding those sort of thing up. And I would say worldwide, I don't know, I'm just making a guess here. We'd be talking 20 to $30 billion a year just for the feminist organizations themselves. Taking this question wider, UN mandated practices, frankly, it's almost impossible. I really, because, feminist mandated practices, that would have to cover people like, well, but we'll take, I can't talk about my own situation because I have to not do that. But let's take an example of Mr. Average in the Western society, who finds himself kicked out of his home through no fault of his own, divorced against his will, ripped from his children. What is the economic impact of him and damage to the economy? There we've got somebody who was possibly reasonably successful in his business, potentially, or in his work. He's now pretty much a wreck. He's not likely to be promoted because he just isn't concentrating on his work anymore because he's just an emotional wreck. That's if he's able to hold on to a job at all. And you start looking at the figures, for example, in again, USA is a good example simply because the figures are easy to get there, of the number of men who just cannot afford to keep up child support payments that have been made to them and are now in prison. It's just a debtor's prison situation in the USA. And you start looking at those people, if they'd been able to stay in a stable family, they would still be working and contributing to the economy instead of being in a prison, being financed by the rest of the taxpayers. And obviously you would get you're always going to get some family breakdowns, but I think we can fairly reasonably put a lot of family breakdowns onto feminist policies. And I think that would be reasonable to do. And if you just put half of them onto feminist policies, the amounts around the world start getting out of hand. It just, no, so I really couldn't make any kind of sensible guess of how much feminism costs the world. It's huge.
You're saying it's a lot? Yeah, right. Yes. Getting back to cultural Marxism a little bit, because yes, Sean said, thank you very much, very revealing. Getting back to cultural Marxism a little bit, would you like to talk a little bit about the Frankfurt School? This might be a concept some people aren't aware of.
Okay, I'm going to start back at two prominent communists before that, if I may, because those who do know about the Frankfurt School may not know about these particular people. And these are kingpins of the Frankfurt School of Cultural Marxism that I think are worth studying, and they're actually very fascinating individuals. One is Antonio Gramsci, that's spelled Gramsci. So I often pronounce it Gramsci, but my Italian friend always corrects me, it's Gramsci. He was the guy that set up the Italian Communist Party in the very early 1930s, I think it was, or late 20s. He thought that since Italy at that time was effectively run by sort of three groups. It was run by the church elites. It was run by the political elites, the politicians, who there were kind of elections, but you always were electing the same people effectively. You know, you could elect, you know, the person who got in power last time, or the person who's going to get into power this time, but you don't really have much of an option. And the nobles, effectively. And so Gramsci asked himself, well, why? Why are these relatively small groups in charge of our country? You know, how come? And he was doing this, asking these questions of himself at the same time that the new science of sociology was being formed. And he came to the conclusion that there was no great difference between sociology and history, and no great difference between history, because history was always useless if you didn't learn from it. So therefore, in learning history, you would learn what is going to come and how to make things come. And by combining the sociology with that, it meant all you had to do is understand how somebody else had managed to do something, and then you knew how to do it yourself. So in studying how was it that these relatively small groups of people had taken over in Italy, he determined how small groups of people could take over a society. And that was his big thing. And that was his big contribution to cultural Marxism, how a small group of people could take over a country culturally. I'll move on. He's the real person. The other person is a Hungarian by the name of György Lukács. Don't ask me to spell it. It's got all kinds of punctuation things on it. but if you just type into Google as best you can, Georgy Lukács and communist, then you'll be able to find him. And he was separately, he was a contemporary of Antonio Gramsci in Italy, but I'm not even sure they ever actually even wrote to one another.
Mm-hmm.
But astonishingly, they were actually coming to similar conclusions at the same time. And Lukács was coming up and realizing that how to break apart a society, because he wanted Russia to come into Hungary, but he realized that there was going to be resistance to that happening. And so he was teaching, he was a minister of education in a very short-lived communist party.
Mm-hmm.
And he was teaching, for example, young children about pornography. And he was introducing the concept that that heterosexuality was not really a very good idea, that homosexuality was, you know, the normal way for humans to behave.
Mm.
All kinds of ridiculous ideas. Yeah, it's astonishing, but some of these were taking grips. But the primary thing is that he came up with how to corrupt a society from within. And you take these two people and their teachings, and you combine them with a sort of think tank college in Vienna.
Mm-hmm.
And then you start getting a communist-minded person who was actually quite wealthy. In today's terms, he'd be a multi-millionaire. And you end up with a principle of, okay, we can actually use these people's information because we don't want Russia to come walking in with the tanks. But we do want to change society so that the populace welcomes communism. And then the guy from Vienna met up with people in Frankfurt and who already existed in something that called the, I can't remember its proper name now, but it's known colloquially as the Frankfurt School. And the Frankfurt School took all these various patterns of thought and developed the detail of how to break apart society, how to introduce Marxism under the bonnet without openly declaring war, without openly declaring what they're up to, without openly declaring anything, but just corrupting society from within. And not really, to be honest, caring about whether they completely cracked society down into anarchy or not. Because there were two major lines of thought. One was take society right back down to caveman level, and they will welcome communism just as a savior. And the other is to crack apart society enough where the only obvious answer is communism. Mm-hmm. And they never really sort of solved that between themselves, as far as I can see. Right? Both are put into practice alongside one another because it doesn't really matter what happens. Either way around, you're going to end up with communism.
Mm. Very good. Thank you very much. Yes, I think that knowing about the Frankfurt School and cultural Marxism, I think it's really important for people certainly with an interest in men's issues and anyone who would call themselves anti-feminist to at least have some sort of working knowledge of these concepts. And I mean, I'm a history geek, so I sort of naturally look at these things from a historical point of view too. But it's really important, I think, that we get this information out there. Which I think is what really, as I said, I really enjoyed your speech actually in terms of the information that was presented. It's a particular interest of mine. Which brings us on to, actually, if we don't have any more questions, countries. So you talked a lot of, obviously, the speeches about the UN and so forth. And we were talking before the recording began, or before the presentation began, about various countries. And so you happy if we chat about a few different countries and the particular situations the countries find themselves in? Now, there's one in particular that came up in our discussion, if you don't mind me mentioning Iran.
Yeah. I found Iran to be a particularly fascinating one to examine, because you tend to think, okay, you know, it's a solid Muslim country, it's got a patriarchal you know, and religious base to it. Yeah, it's going to be secure from feminism, you know. It's the last kind of place you expect, you know, feminism to be able to get it correct. It's just going to be kicked into touch. And I think it's a good example of how clever the Frankfurt School was in conceiving of their methods and how to go about something. Because as far as I could say, and I'm not a specialist on Iran by any means. So by all means, you know, if you want to find more information, find a specialist on Iran, because I would love to sort of, you know, also hear from a specialist on Iran. But I saw Iran move from a position where, from my Western and inevitably already feminist infected attitudes, Iran looked to me like, you know, over the top patriarchy, over the top men dominating women and stuff. And it moved from that within just 2 years to what is distinctly really now a feminist society. It's not as feminist as countries like the UK, Australia and so forth, but it has a distinctly feminist taint to it now. And it's changing its laws, you know, all the time now, more and more towards feminism. And yes, from my aspect, from a Western culture, I could say, well, yeah, it needed to change a bit. But then again, I'm coming from a Western culture. And the more I've examined culture in the Middle East, the more I've seen, for example, that, you know, it's like so much of feminism, you know, where you only look at one side. And you say, oh, you know, women, you know, in these countries, they're not allowed to go outdoors, you know, which is actually a bit extreme. They are allowed to. Men don't go shopping. You know, it's typically, you know, the woman that does the shopping, for example. So, of course, men do go outdoors. But yes, you know, they're going outdoors fully covered and everything. But then, hang on, it's not just one-sided, because the man of the house, it doesn't have to be the husband, the man of the house is expected to provide financially, and provide financially for whatever the woman wants. And when you realize that when the husband dies in accident or ill health or in war, the man of the house becomes the next oldest male. And it doesn't matter if he's 12 or 13. He's expected to provide for the household. And that's it. There are some shockingly horrifying, you know, aspects to that. You know, you're getting 12 or 13-year-olds, they're having to sell themselves any bloody way they can in order to keep a family of 5 going. So rather than look upon these sort of societies as just putting down men, I have gradually come to see them as having a sharp divide between what's expected of women and what's expected of men. And there is a great deal expected of both. And I'm not necessarily convinced that that society is any worse than Western society, once you really come to understand it.
Yeah, and I tend to agree with that, and that's something I think a position that many MRAs will agree with, that when you really dig down in a lot of societies, yes, there may well be obligations on women in that society, but there are obligations on the men as well. And I mean, we have obligations like the duty to serve in the military and so forth. So there are situations there where we often hear about. Well, one example that I've researched is Israel. I mean, we know that Israeli women can volunteer for military service, but what isn't reported is that they are usually put in border protection units and not frontline infantry units. So even though there are women in combat per se, they're not actually in the frontline infantry units. They put them in the border protection units. Yes, those are combat units, but not the ones that are most likely to end up in combat. So there's even in countries like Israel where they do put women in the military, there's very few actually being exposed to the same level of risk as men. So I tend to agree. Well, we're coming up close to our closing time now, but I do tend to agree that yes, there's that across societies, and I must admit, recently I've been wondering if there's some sort of balance that was occurring in ancient societies where men and women both had obligations. I think that's an area perhaps I'd like to see explored more. But we probably should finish up. Are there any final questions for Douglas? Douglas, any final comments as we wrap up over the next couple of minutes?
Just really to people to think about the international level, and if they're not particularly active in men's rights, and they're currently thinking, yes, I need to be doing something, to at least consider a specialization for themselves in the international field. That's really my appeal. If you're already busy, you're already dealing with domestic violence or parental alienation or education or whatever it is, in the country you're in, please just stick with it by all means, because you're needed there. But if you're thinking, well, yeah, I'm not sure, yeah, have a look at the international scene. It's huge. So that it's not just a matter of, education, or because if you're interested in education, yeah, there's educational aspects in the international scene, and we need people in every sphere. The United Nations covers almost everything in your life, so it doesn't really matter, you can get involved in any stage.
That's a really good point, actually. Thank you very much, Douglas. Thank you, Natalie, and thank you to all of our attendees today. And with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you. Bye-bye.